75 years? 3/4 of a century of music that did not simply entertain, but healed. Stevie Wonder, the man who never once saw the world with his eyes, yet taught the world to see with its soul. 25 Grammy Awards, over 100 million records sold, songs so deeply woven into the fabric of human emotion that generations who were not yet born when he wrote them still weep at the first chord. He did not just make music, he became music. A blind boy from Saginaw, Michigan, who transformed darkness into the most luminous sound the 20th century had ever heard. A genius who moved presidents, moved nations, and moved hearts that had forgotten how to feel. But behind the radiant smile, behind the rocking rhythm that fans mistook for joy, behind the legend the world so desperately needed to believe in, lies a story almost too painful to tell. A story of loss stacked upon loss, of a body failing in silence, of a marriage that shattered the man beneath the music, of children kept distant by pain neither money nor fame could heal, of an industry that consumed him, and of a final devastating chapter that has left those closest to him whispering words no one ever imagined saying about Stevie Wonder. The world has celebrated his light for decades, but few have dared to look at the darkness he has carried alone. Before we go further, if even one of his songs has ever touched something inside you that words alone could not reach, leave a like, not for the algorithm, but as a quiet tribute to a man who gave his entire life so that others could feel less alone. This is the truth behind the legend, and it is beyond heartbreaking. The boy who was never meant to see. Stevland Hardaway Morris entered the world on May 13, 1950, in Saginaw, Michigan, 6 weeks too soon, and fighting for every breath. The hospital staff placed him inside an incubator, flooding it with pure oxygen in a desperate attempt to keep him alive. They saved his life. But in doing so, they took something that could never be returned. The excess oxygen destroyed the blood vessels behind both of his eyes, a condition called retinopathy of prematurity. By the time his mother, Lula Mae Hardaway, carried him home, her son was permanently, irreversibly blind. He would never see her face. He would never see sunlight on water, or the color of autumn leaves, or the expression on a stranger's face when his music made them cry. He would never see anything, and he was not yet 1 year old. Lula Mae was 21 years old, poor, and largely alone. His father, Calvin Judkins, was a man who drifted in and out of their lives like a cold wind through a carelessly opened door. He offered little warmth and even less stability. When Stevie was 4, Lula Mae gathered her children and relocated to Detroit in search of something better. What she found was a 2-room apartment in one of the city's most unforgiving neighborhoods, where the walls were thin, the winters merciless, and dignity was something you fought for every single day. There was almost nothing. And yet, inside that almost nothing, something extraordinary was already stirring. From the very beginning, Stevie heard the world differently. Every sound carried texture, color, weight. The creak of floorboards, the distant wail of a saxophone from a neighbor's radio. The day the boy became a man, nobody was ready for. In 1971, Stevie Wonder turned 21 years old, and with that birthday came a reckoning the music industry had not anticipated and was entirely unprepared to face. Under the laws governing child performers, the contract signed on his behalf expired the moment he reached adulthood. The trust fund Motown had managed in his name was finally his to access. And what he found, with the help of lawyers he had chosen himself for the first time in his life, was a truth as cold as a Detroit winter. The fortune that should have been waiting was a fraction of what it should have been. A child who had generated millions for a record label had reached adulthood with far less than the world imagined. He walked away from Motown, not in anger, but in something more deliberate and more dangerous. Silence. For months, one of the most successful artists in the label's history simply stopped. No recordings, no performances, no negotiations on their terms. Berry Gordy now faced the possibility that Stevie Wonder, at 21, was prepared to walk out the door and never return. But Stevie did not want simply more money. He wanted something far more radical for a black artist in the early 1970s. Complete creative control. The right to write his own music, produce his own albums, own his masters, and be in every sense the author of his own artistic life. Motown resisted. The label had been built on a system of control, a production line of polished sound. The idea of handing full creative autonomy to any artist was against the foundational philosophy of everything Gordy had built. But Stevie Wonder did not blink, and eventually, Gordy yielded. In 1972, Stevie signed a new contract unprecedented in its terms: complete creative control, improved royalty rates, the right to own his publishing through his own company, Black Bull Music. It was not simply a record deal, it was a declaration of artistic independence that reshaped what was possible for musicians, particularly black musicians, in the American recording industry. What followed was astonishing. Between 1972 and 1976, Stevie Wonder released 5 albums now universally regarded among the greatest bodies of work in the history of popular music. Music of My Mind, Talking Book, Inner Visions, Fulfillingness, First Finale, and Songs in the Key of Life. He played nearly every instrument himself. He composed. He produced. He pushed the boundaries of what a soul record could contain, weaving jazz and funk and gospel and classical and African rhythms into something that had no predecessor and has had no true successor. The world responded with a reverence usually reserved for figures who emerge only once in a generation. But the triumph had cost him something no Grammy could replace. The years of fighting for control had hardened something in a man raised on gentleness and gospel. He had won. Undeniably, magnificently won. But victory in the music industry is never clean. And the scars of a childhood spent as someone else's asset did not dissolve in the glow of 5 masterpiece albums. They went underground, quiet, patient, waiting. 4 days between sound and silence. On August 6, 1973, Stevie Wonder was 23 years old and at the absolute peak of his creative powers. Inner Visions had just been released. Critics were already calling it a masterpiece. He was traveling by car through Surry County, North Carolina, en route to a concert in Durham. A logging truck traveling in the opposite direction lost a large piece of timber from its load. The log struck the windshield and ricocheted directly into his skull, with a force so violent that those who witnessed the aftermath believed, with quiet and terrible certainty, that Stevie Wonder was dead. He was not dead, but for 4 days he was somewhere the living could not reach. The coma was deep and unresponsive. Doctors spoke in careful, measured tones that concealed more than they revealed. Brain damage was a possibility they could not dismiss. The musical genius that had produced Talking Book and Inner Visions was suspended somewhere between this world and whatever lies beyond it. His mother, Lula Mae, sat beside his bed and sang. Gospel songs she had hummed in their small Detroit kitchen. She sang because it was the only language she trusted to reach him wherever he had gone. On the 4th day, a musician friend leaned close to Stevie's ear and began singing one of his own songs back to him. Higher Ground, a song about the soul's refusal to be extinguished. Stevie's fingers began to move. He was following the thread of his own music back to the surface like a diver ascending from impossible depth. He woke, and the world exhaled. But waking was only the beginning. The brain injury permanently altered his sense of smell, a loss that for a man whose entire relationship with the world was constructed through senses other than sight represented a specific and irreversible devastation. The headaches were relentless. The recovery was measured in months of painful, uncertain reconstruction. He did not return as the same man. The accident cracked something open that success and creative triumph had not been able to reach. It forced a confrontation with mortality so raw and absolute that it permanently altered his relationship with music, with faith, and with the question of what a life is actually for. Songs in the Key of Life, released in 1976, 3 years after he had lain comatose in a North Carolina hospital, is widely regarded as the greatest album ever recorded. Not simply one of the great soul records, the greatest. A double album of such staggering emotional range, musical complexity, and spiritual depth that it seemed made by someone who had briefly visited a place beyond human understanding and returned with the music they heard there, because in a very real sense, that is exactly what had happened. The near-death experience made him not more cautious, but more urgent, more achingly aware that every moment of creation was a gift that could be revoked without warning. When Songs in the Key of Life was released, Stevie Wonder won the Grammy for Album of the Year for the second consecutive time, an achievement so unprecedented that the Recording Academy has never quite recovered its composure when discussing it. He had stared into the void, and instead of being consumed by it, he had brought back something luminous. But luminous things cast shadows, and the shadows gathering around Stevie Wonder in the years following his greatest triumph were longer and darker than the world, celebrating his genius with such joyful abandon could yet see. The Weight of Being, Everyone's Light. By the early 1980s, Stevie Wonder had achieved something beyond ordinary measurements of fame. He had become necessary, a figure so deeply embedded in the emotional architecture of an entire culture that his absence from any significant moment felt like a gap where something essential should have been. In 1980, he embarked on a campaign that had nothing to do with music and everything to do with justice. For years, activists had been pushing for a federal holiday honoring Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The campaign had stalled repeatedly in Congress, blocked by opposition that carried the unmistakable scent of something older and uglier. Stevie threw himself into the fight with a totality that alarmed even those who admired him most. He composed Happy Birthday as an explicit anthem for the campaign, performed at rallies across the country, lobbied senators personally, and collected 6 million signatures on a petition. He refused to perform in states that opposed the holiday, a financial sacrifice made without hesitation or public complaint. In 1983, President Reagan signed the legislation. The victory belonged to countless people. But there was broad acknowledgement that Stevie Wonder's relentless commitment had been among the forces that finally made it real. In 1985, he stood in a recording studio alongside the most famous musicians on the planet and recorded "We Are the World." When his turn at the microphone came, the room that had been professionally controlled all evening shifted into something closer to reverence. The single raised over $60 million and became the fastest-selling American pop single in history at that time. But the cost was accumulating with an interest that fame does not publicize. The Stevie Wonder the public saw was radiant, always available, always willing, always there. The Stevie Wonder behind that image was a man being slowly consumed by the impossibility of the role he had accepted. He was no longer simply allowed to be an artist. He was expected to be a conscience. Every injustice demanded his voice. Every cause looked toward him with the quiet expectation that he would show up, sing, and lend the moral authority of his presence to whatever the moment required. His personal life was fracturing in ways the spotlights avoided. His first marriage to Sarita Wright had ended after 2 years. He had children with multiple women across the years, relationships carrying the inevitable complexity of a man whose schedule belonged to the world. He loved his children with a depth no one who knew him doubted. But love cannot compensate for absence, and Stevie Wonder was absent in the specific way that men consumed by purpose are absent. Present in the room, but unreachable. The isolation was profound and paradoxical. He could walk into any room on earth and be surrounded immediately by people eager for his company. And yet, the particular loneliness of the extraordinarily famous is one of the cruelest there is. A loneliness surrounded by noise and adulation, invisible to everyone except the person enduring it. The decade that crowned him produced award after award, collaboration after collaboration. But crowns are heavy. And the man beneath this one was beginning, quietly and without announcement, to show the first signs of strain. The light he gave to millions was real and rare, and genuinely extraordinary. But no one asked who was keeping the light alive, and what it was costing him to burn. The marriage that broke. What fame could not. There are wounds that fame cannot reach, not because fame is insufficient, but because some wounds are located in a place so private that no amount of public adoration can find them, let alone heal them. He met Kai Millard Morris in the late 1990s. She was a fashion designer, quietly formidable, a woman who seemed to understand both the demands of his public life and the complexity of the private man beneath it. They married in 2001. 2 children followed, Kayland and Mandla. For a period it appeared that Stevie Wonder had finally found the domestic peace his extraordinary life had always worked against. But appearances in the lives of the extraordinarily famous are almost always partially constructed. In 2009, Kai filed for divorce. The announcement used the phrase irreconcilable differences, the phrase chosen specifically because it forecloses further questioning while providing the appearance of transparency. The details that emerged in the years that followed were neither brief nor carefully worded. There were claims about emotional unavailability so profound it bordered on neglect, about a man so consumed by music and obligation that the people closest to him were left waiting in a silence all the more painful for being the silence of a man famous for filling the world with sound. There were disputes about finances, about the division of assets, about what Kai and the children were owed not just legally, but humanly. The custody arrangements for Kayland and Mandla became a source of tension that persisted long after the legal proceedings concluded. Children caught in the gravitational field of 2 people whose love for them was genuine, but whose ability to coexist in raising them had been severely damaged by the acrimony of separation. For a man who had written, "You are the sunshine of my life," who had composed "Isn't She Lovely" as a direct expression of overwhelming love, who had spent 5 decades telling the world that love was the most powerful force in human experience, the contradiction was not simply painful, it was existential. The answer, uncomfortable as it is that they are not contradictory at all. They are the same man who felt love with extraordinary depth and expressed it with extraordinary beauty, also failed, as human beings fail, to translate that feeling consistently into the sustained, patient, unglamorous daily practice that love in a marriage actually requires. Genius does not exempt anyone from human limitation, and Stevie Wonder was limited in the specific ways that men consumed by a singular purpose since childhood tend to be limited. The divorce was finalized after years of proceedings. The public allowed the story to fade because it is easier to remember Stevie Wonder as the man who sang about love than to sit with the more complicated truth of a man who struggled to live it. But the wounds did not fade with the headlines. The distance between Stevie and his sons from this marriage became a source of private grief those close to him described with careful, protective vagueness. He had written the most beautiful love songs the world had ever heard. And in the ruins of his second marriage, he confronted the most humbling truth of his extraordinary life. That the heart, even one capable of making 1 billion strangers feel less alone, is not immune to its own particular loneliness, the voice that taught him to hear the world. There are people whose presence is so fundamental, so woven into the fabric of who we are, that we do not fully understand the weight of what they carry for us until the moment they are gone. For Stevie Wonder, that person was Lula Mae Hardaway. She had been there from the very beginning, the young woman who sat beside an incubator in a Saginaw hospital and watched her premature son fight for breath, not yet knowing that the oxygen saving his life was stealing his sight. The woman who carried him home blind into a world with no guaranteed place for him, and decided, with quiet, unshakable conviction, that her son would not be defined by what he could not see. She had hummed gospel songs in a small kitchen while her boy found rhythms in their shared poverty. She had been the one constant through 5 decades of triumph, failure, accident, divorce, and fame so total it had become its own kind of isolation. She died in 2006, and the fixed point was gone. Those close to him described a man fundamentally altered, not broken in the dramatic way that makes for compelling headlines, but altered in the quieter, more permanent way of someone from whom something irreplaceable has been removed. He spoke about her in interviews with a tenderness so unguarded it was almost difficult to witness. She was everything, he said simply. And in those 2 words lived a grief too large for more elaborate expression. But Lula Mae was not the first loss. She was not even the first whose absence had carved a permanent mark into him. Marvin Gaye, his friend and peer, the man whose artistic ambition most closely mirrored his own, had been killed in 1984. Stevie wept at the funeral in a way that went beyond ordinary mourning. He had lost not just a friend, but a witness, someone who understood from the inside what it cost to be what they both were. Michael Jackson, with whom he had shared decades of friendship, died in 2009, the same year his marriage was publicly collapsing. 2 griefs arriving simultaneously, the public one and the private one. Prince, whose musical genius had existed in a similarly stratospheric altitude, died in 2016. Another peer, another voice that had understood, without requiring explanation, the specific loneliness of being that gifted in a world not quite designed to accommodate that level of gift. Each loss was its own wound, and wounds accumulate. They do not stack in a neat pile. They interact. They complicate each other. They create a weight that becomes not a series of individual losses, but a fundamental condition of existence. After Lula Mae died, those who knew Stevie best noticed something shifting in his relationship with his own music. Not an absence of creativity, but a heaviness that had not been there before. A sense that the wellspring from which everything had always flowed was changed, colored by something that even music could not entirely metabolize. He began speaking more frequently about faith, about the conviction that the people we lose do not simply disappear, that reunion waits. that the separations of this life are temporary in a way that grief makes almost impossible to believe, but that faith insists upon anyway. It was the testimony of a man who needed it to be true, who had lost enough to require the consolation of continuity. The boy who had learned to hear the world from his mother's humming in a Detroit kitchen was now a man navigating a world from which that voice had been permanently withdrawn. And the silence left behind was the kind that no music, however luminous, could fill. The body that carried too much for too long. There is a particular cruelty reserved for those whose gift lives entirely within them. When the body that carries the gift begins to fail, it does not simply threaten a career. It threatens the very channel through which a life has found its meaning. For Stevie Wonder, the signs had been present for years before the public was invited to know. Those closest to him spoke in careful, protective language about his health, about a fatigue beyond ordinary exhaustion, about a pallor that makeup could conceal on stage, but that was visible in unguarded moments, about a slowing knot of his mind, which remained as sharp and musically voracious as ever, but of his body, which was presenting a bill for decades of relentless demand. The kidneys were failing. It was not sudden catastrophe. It was the slow, grinding deterioration of organs under sustained stress, a process advancing for years before it reached the threshold of crisis. Kidney disease of this severity accumulates. It erodes. It takes from a person gradually enough that the person can almost convince themselves that what they are experiencing is simply age, simply tiredness, simply the ordinary wearing down of a body used hard and long. The dialysis that preceded the transplant was its own particular indignity for a man who had spent his life in motion. Dialysis requires stillness, schedule, submitting the body to a machine that does the work organs are supposed to do on their own, sitting for hours while blood is cleaned outside the body and returned. For a man whose relationship with his body had always been defined by what it could produce, dialysis was a confrontation with limitations so stark it could not be minimized or transformed into metaphor. He kept it private as long as he could. In 2019, at a performance in London, he told his audience directly. A kidney transplant was scheduled. He was stepping back. He needed time to heal. The announcement landed with the weight of news that confirms what fear had been quietly whispering. The audience responded not with ordinary applause, but with something closer to the sound a community makes when it realizes it has been taking something precious for granted. The transplant was successful. The recovery was long and conducted with the privacy of a man more practiced at being strong for others than allowing others to witness his vulnerability. Those who visited him described a Stevie Wonder they had not seen before. Quieter, more reflective. As if the enforced pause had created a space for a quality of attention his relentless forward momentum had never previously allowed. Then the world closed entirely. In 2020, the pandemic arrived with particular menace for those whose immune systems were compromised by transplant medications. Exposure to the virus in his condition carried risks that made isolation not a choice, but a medical necessity. He retreated, and the man who had spent 70 years filling the world with sound found himself in a silence more enforced than any since those 4 days of coma in a North Carolina hospital nearly 50 years before. He used the time as he had always used difficulty. He wrote. He called his children. He sat at his keyboard and allowed music to do what it had always done. Not fill the silence exactly, but give it a shape that could be inhabited rather than merely endured. When he re-emerged, the physical change was visible in a way that moved people. He was thinner, more deliberate in his movements. The rocking at the keyboard was gentler now, slower, as if the body had learned, through the long education of illness and recovery, a new relationship with the rhythm of its own existence. He was still Stevie Wonder. The voice remained. The music remained. But he was a man marked by mortality, in a way that was new and impossible to pretend away. When the prophet becomes a stranger in his own land, there is a particular loneliness that belongs exclusively to those who have spent their lives as symbols. When that person, in the fullness of their age and accumulated experience, makes choices that do not conform to the projection, the world does not simply disagree. It feels betrayed. Stevie Wonder had been a symbol for so long that most people had forgotten that symbols do not make decisions. People do. And Stevie Wonder, at 70 years old, carrying a transplanted kidney and the accumulated grief of a life lived at impossible altitude, was no longer willing to subordinate the decisions of the person to the demands of the symbol. For years, he had been speaking with growing directness about race in America, about the persistence of systemic inequality, about the documented reality of Black Americans being killed by those whose sworn purpose was to protect them. These were not new positions. He had been making music about racial justice since the 1970s, but the tone had shifted. The patience that had made him palatable across racial and political lines was giving way to something rawer, more exhausted, more willing to name what it saw without softening the naming for the comfort of those who preferred their social commentary melodic and unthreatening. He announced his intention to relocate to Ghana, not as metaphor, not as rhetorical gesture, but as a genuine, considered intention rooted in a conclusion reached after 7 decades of living in a country he had loved publicly and served generously. Some heard it as the statement of a man who had earned the right to make whatever choice served his peace. Others heard it as abandonment. The criticism came from unexpected directions, including from within the communities that had always claimed him most proudly. Voices interpreting his departure as surrender rather than conclusion. He was called disconnected, out of touch. A wealthy man whose Beverly Hills lifestyle had insulated him from the struggle he claimed to be fleeing. He responded with the directness of a man who had exhausted the patience required to explain himself. He was not abandoning America, he said. He was choosing himself, his health, the peace his compromised body genuinely required. The right, at 70 years old, after everything, to live the remainder of his life in a way that served his well-being rather than the expectations of a public that had been consuming him since he was 10 years old. The Ghana move materialized quietly and more complexly than the announcement suggested. He spent time there. He spoke about the continent with love clearly rooted in something deeper than protest. If even one of his songs has ever touched something inside you, that words alone could not declaration of departure became, as such declarations often do, but as a statement of intent to a man rather than his entire severance, so that others could feel less entirely. This the man who had spent 70 years building an image of warmth and inclusive humanity found himself no longer quite fitting the monument the world had built around him. Too political for those who wanted only the music, too wealthy to be credible to those who wanted only the activism, too human to fit comfortably inside the legend. And the world was not entirely sure what to do with what remained when the legend stepped aside and the man stood in his place. Tired, marked by illness, choosing rest, choosing himself. What remains when the world stops watching? At 75 years old, Stevie Wonder does not move through the world the way he once did. The man who once crossed continents between Monday and Friday has slowed, not stopped, slowed. And in the slowing, something has become visible that the velocity of his extraordinary life always obscured. The man himself. His children are the gravitational center of whatever remains of his daily life. 6 children across several relationships. each a different chapter of his complicated, generous, imperfect history of love. Aisha, born in 1975, whose arrival inspired Isn't She Lovely? Keita, Mumtaz, Sophia, Kailand, and Mandla, each carrying the particular inheritance of being raised in the long shadow of a father whose gifts were immense, whose presence was sometimes insufficient, and whose love was never in question even when his availability was. He speaks about his children now with a humility not always present in earlier decades, about the recitals missed, the ordinary evenings that accumulated into childhoods he was not fully present for. He cannot recover those years, but he is present now in a way those who know him describe with quiet emotion. More patient, more still, more willing to simply be there, without needing the room to become a stage. The music continues. There are recordings in various states of completion in the private archive of a man who has never stopped creating because creation is as necessary as breathing. An album has been promised for years. He will finish it on no timeline but his own. For a man whose childhood earnings were managed by others, that freedom is not simply a contractual privilege. It is a kind of justice. His fortune insulates him from every practical concern, but he speaks of wealth with the detachment of a man who learned that money solves the problems money can solve and is useless against the ones that matter most. What it can do, and what he has directed it toward, is create possibility for those who have none. Music education for young people in communities where it has been defunded. Healthcare access for those whose circumstances resemble a premature baby in a Saginaw hospital in 1950. Poor and vulnerable, entirely dependent on the quality of care available to people without resources. His faith remains the architecture beneath everything. The gospel humming of Lula Mae in a Detroit kitchen was the first music he absorbed, and it never left. He speaks about it now without softening. He believes in the continuation of those he has loved and lost, in reunion, in the grace of a universe that took his sight before he could open his eyes and gave him in exchange the ability to hear everything. At 75, the rocking continues, slower, gentler, but still present. The sound that began in a small Detroit apartment, found by a blind boy in the rhythm of ordinary life, is still sounding. The light that taught the world to see. And so we arrive at the truth that the applause always drowned out. The truth about the boy from Saginaw, who never saw a single day of the world he spent his entire life illuminating. Stevie Wonder did not transcend his suffering. He carried it, every piece of it, the blindness and the poverty, and the industry that consumed his childhood earnings, and the marriage that collapsed under the weight of his absence, and the mother whose voice was the first music, and whose silence was the loudest loss, and the kidney that failed, and the friends who died too young, and the country that celebrated him for decades, and then questioned him when he chose himself. He carried all of it, and he kept playing. That is not a fairy tale. Fairy tales require the suffering to be resolved, the wound to heal cleanly. What Stevie Wonder's life offers is something harder and more honest. The image of a man marked by everything that happened to him who created, from those marks, something so luminous that it has outlasted every darkness it was born inside of. He was not perfect. He was absent when presence was needed. He was consumed by a gift that did not leave room for the ordinary requirements of love. He was, in all the ways that matter most, entirely human. And that is precisely why his story matters. Not because he was superhuman, but because he was not. Because a blind boy born into poverty in 1950, robbed of sight by the very intervention that saved his life, somehow produced the most extraordinary body of work in the history of American music. Not despite his suffering, from it, out of it, because of it. The darkness was not the obstacle to the light. The darkness was the condition in which the light became necessary. At 75, he is not the figure nostalgia requires. He is a man, tired in some ways, marked by illness, choosing rest, choosing his children, choosing himself. And in choosing himself, he is doing something the symbol could never do, but that the man has earned completely. He is living. Not performing living for public consumption. Actually, privately, imperfectly, preciously living. The world gave Stevie Wonder its highest honors, and he received them with the grace of a man who understood what they represented and the humility of a man who knew what they could not see. What they could not see was the cost, the years of dialysis, the marriages that failed, the children who needed more than fame could give, the mother whose absence left a silence no music could fill, the friends lowered into earth one by one. He once said that music is a world within itself, with a language we all understand. He was talking about what music does for listeners, but he was also describing what music had done for him, given him a world within the world, a place where blindness was irrelevant and losses could be, for the duration of a song, transformed into something that made other people feel less alone. He gave us that world for 75 years. Every note, a gift. Every album, a piece of a life offered openly to strangers who needed it more than they knew. What we owe Stevie Wonder is the willingness to see him whole. The man and the music together. The triumph and the tragedy together. The light and the darkness together. Because one without the other is not truth. It is comfort, dressed as tribute. He was born unable to see, and he spent 75 years teaching the rest of us how. If his music has ever reached something inside you that words alone could not find, leave a like. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe, because the stories that matter most are rarely the ones easiest to tell. And the next time you hear the opening notes of Superstition, or the quiet grace of You Are the Sunshine of My Life, or the devastating beauty of A's, remember what it cost him to make it. Remember the boy in the incubator, the poverty, the coma, the divorce, the dialysis chair, the mother's grave, the friends gone silent one by one. Remember all of it. And then let the music play. Because it was made for exactly this moment. For when the weight of being human feels too heavy to carry alone. For when we need to be reminded, by someone who had every reason to know otherwise and chose to believe it anyway, that life, in all its cruelty and all its beauty, is, as Stevie Wonder has always insisted with every note he has ever played, worth singing about,